You're about to watch an in-depth video where I interview one of the world's leading Septuagint scholars, that is Dr. William Ross. And in this video, we go really deep. We go into manuscripts of the Septuagint. We talk about conspiracies regarding the Septuagint. We even talk about what Jesus may have had access to in regards to the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures in Greek. It goes very deep into the weeds. If you like this sort of thing and you make it to the end of this video, I'm curious how many of you are really interested in going into that kind of depth. So I would invite you, if you make it to the end of this video, write the words digging deep in the comments. And without further ado, let's get right into the interview. Well, friends, I'm so happy to have Dr. William Ross on the channel today. He has a PhD from the University of Cambridge, and he's an expert in the Septuagint. And I get a lot of questions about the Septuagint. I really love the Septuagint, and he's written one of the best books, co-author of one of the best books, in my opinion, on the Septuagint, and I'll leave links in the description for that. But I want to open up and just allow you to introduce yourself to us, Dr. Ross.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Appreciate the invitation to come on here. Glad to be here, talk about this stuff. It's some of my favorite things to talk about. Like you said, I'm a Septuagint scholar. I am based in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I am an assistant professor of Old Testament at Reformed Theological Seminary. I've been here for about 6 years. And prior to that, I did my doctoral work at Cambridge in Septuagint scholarship and have focused much of my writing and research in that area. Do some other things on the side here and there in terms of my research interests, but that's the main focus. I'm married and have 4 kids, and yeah, that's a little bit about.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So let's just open this up. One of the things I want to touch on today is I want to ask you about some of the conspiracy theories that float around about the Septuagint. But before we get started, can you define for me what the Septuagint is and tell me if that's even a helpful term anymore?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I will say this multiple times throughout our talk today. It really depends on how you define the Septuagint, because most of the issues we'll discuss get hung up on this issue. Okay, so the term Septuagint, as it's used in most contemporary academic circles, is really a catch-all term that can mean a couple of specific things when people specify it. But generally speaking, it refers to the ancient Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible made by Jews. And in addition to those translations of the Hebrew Bible, you get a handful of other Jewish Greek writings that were not translations, but just composed in Greek, things like the Maccabees, the books of the Maccabees, some of them, Judith, perhaps, Tobit, and other works that are commonly known as deuterocanonical books or apocrypha or pseudepigrapha, depending on the book you're talking about. So that all that stuff, which kind of is a set of overlapping circles, usually goes under the rubric the Septuagint. That's the broad definition. There are stricter definitions too, which I'm sure we'll get into as we go along here. So that's how I use it, and I'll specify as I go along. But it can be more of a stumbling block than anything else when it comes to some of these issues. So yes, it's still a helpful term, as long as you don't trip on your own shoelaces as you go along.
Okay. All right. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so let's just dive in, because again, I hear some wild things about the Septuagint. There's some mainstream scholarship that's out there, but there's some scholarship, or if you want to call it pseudo scholarship, kind of on the fringes. And the internet is a really lovely place for some of those things to flourish. So let's just go right into it. Here's my first question: did the Septuagint exist before the time of Christ, or is it a post-Christian invention?
Yeah. So there's a very short and a very long answer to this question. The very short answer is yes, the Septuagint existed prior to the time of Christ. Um, the longer question, I'll sort of do a little sortie into the longer question. Um, Oftentimes, you don't hear people deny this very often. Okay, there are very few people. Well, I can't think of anybody I know in the sort of standard secular academic world that I move through who would deny this, that the Septuagint existed prior to the Christian era. Um, Among the people who would deny it, usually there is theological bias involved in that denial. Okay, so part of the issue, told you I would come to this soon, depends on the definition. All right. When you say the Septuagint, it depends on what you mean. Okay, so when those who would deny this deny it, they're saying, well, there's no full written big stack of papers that resembles a book called the Septuagint prior to the Christian era. And in a sense, that's correct. But that's correct for the reason that I just mentioned about the definition, right? What we don't have is a full bound hard copy version titled Septuagint in the days of Paul, for example. What we do have are existing Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible circulating both in Judea and in diaspora Judaism that are in use in various ways in various places among Jews. We also have some manuscript evidence for Greek texts that date prior to the turn of the era, but those are limited. One of the things that those who would deny this will point to is our earliest full manuscripts, right? Think of a book known as a codex, right? Our earliest full codices for the Septuagint, meaning the whole corpus, are Christian era, right? Second, third, fourth centuries. Therefore, there is no Septuagint prior to the Christian era. So again, it depends on how you define things. If you're talking about full corpus bound book, no, it doesn't exist. If you're talking about Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, yes, it certainly did exist. So I'll pause there and let you kind of insert some more detailed questions if you want.
So, would would Paul, when he's going around these different cities, would he have something in his possession that he would recognize as a translation that came from the 70, so to speak? He probably wouldn't call it the Septuagint, but he would recognize, hey, these Greek manuscripts that I have of, let's keep it simple, to the first 5 books of Moses, right? For example, he has a copy of, let's just say, for example, he's going to one city. We don't know what he had, but would it be plausible that he might have in his possession or access to, a copy of Deuteronomy, a Greek translation that he would recognize as a translation that would trace its way back, at least in some way, to Alexandria and that translation work that was done back there? Or is that questionable? Or what do you think about that?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. I think Paul and other New Testament authors certainly were familiar with Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible. Notice that I'm not using the word Septuagint. They may have had various kinds of access to those translations. They may have memorized them. That's not to the exclusion of Hebrew manuscripts, Hebrew text and language as well. But there's no doubt that the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek had begun a few centuries prior to the time of Christ. It began outside of Judea, but by the time of at least the second century, maybe the first, certainly the first century prior to Christ, there are Greek copies of Scripture in Greek circulating in Judea, and these are in use to some extent, maybe not as great of an extent as Hebrew copies, and these are known by the authors of Scripture. So that's pretty clear. We don't know exactly what text is going to be in what language. So in 2 Timothy 4:13, when Paul tells Timothy to bring the parchments, right?
Hmm.
We don't know what language those parchments would have been in, but Paul's writing in Greek, obviously. So there's a good chance, at least, that at least some of those parchments are Greek parchments of Scripture. So yeah, I think the answer is certainly.
So, that being said, then, is there. Now, I'm getting very detailed here, and so these are for people who are unfamiliar with this. They're used to very simple, straightforward. Yes, he definitely used the Septuagint. No, he didn't use the Septuagint. No, he didn't have it, and it's quite complex, right? So, is there something that's recognizable? Is it more than there's a bunch of Greek translations that are available in the first century? Paul's got one that's translated by who knows who, and then somebody else has got one that's translated by, let's just stick with the book of Deuteronomy just to keep it simple, or the Pentateuch. Paul's got a copy over here. It was translated by we don't know who, and then somebody else has got a translation. Luke's got a translation, but we don't know who translated that. Or would there be something that's recognizable that's been sort of standardized by this point that, maybe it's anachronistic to call it the Septuagint, but it's recognizable that, hey, this comes from the same translation stream. Luke's copy of the Pentateuch matches what Paul has, enough that we can say this comes from the same transmission stream. Does that kind of make sense? What I'm trying to ask? I know that's probably not scholarly precise, but
No, yeah, it does make sense. And the answer to that is yes, for the most part. Okay. I think it would help if I sort of backed up a little bit and gave a little bit of a chronology
yep,
of the origins of what we call the Septuagint.
yep,
So it's sort of a long process, the process of translating Hebrew scriptures into Greek. It begins in probably the mid third century BC, probably in Egypt, maybe Alexandria, maybe some other parts in the Egyptian countryside where Jewish communities were located from at least the 5th century. But in Greek controlled Ptolemaic Egypt, Jewish communities began to translate the Pentateuch, first 5 books of Moses, into Greek in the mid 3rd century BC. After that, translation continues, okay? And it continues throughout the other books of the Hebrew Bible. We do not know for sure when any given book was translated or necessarily where. There are probably some books that were translated back in Judea rather than in Greek Egypt, but we're not sure for any given book, and scholars disagree for various reasons. But there's fairly wide agreement that the last or latest translation into Greek of a canonical Hebrew Bible book was probably in the 1st century AD. So we're talking about 3, maybe a bit more centuries of activity, not centralized, not standardized necessarily, of translation into Greek. So some of the parts of that Greek corpus, Greek versions of the Hebrew Bible, will have become fairly standard. Okay, so the Greek Pentateuch, for example, by the days of Paul, it's going to be pretty standard. You'll have the typical sorts of text critical differences and variants among manuscripts, but yes, there's a sort of mainstream, if you will, of Greek manuscripts for the Greek Pentateuch. Now, there's a plot twist, though, involved here because for some parts of the corpus, there's different translation preferences that develop among these different Jewish communities who are doing this translation work. Some of it's less meticulous than other Jews might have preferred. And so somewhere in the midst of that timeline, towards the 2nd and 1st century BC, some revision activity begins, where existing Greek translations are tweaked and changed and updated in certain ways, still in Greek. So we're going Greek to Greek, but there's revision also mixed into the stream of textual transmission of the Greek translations themselves. So it's not perfectly uniform. There's disagreements among the broad, sort of far-flung Jewish community over what kind of translation is best. But overall, yeah, there's going to be recognizable, somewhat standard translations, particularly for books like the Pentateuch, the Psalms, and maybe Isaiah as well.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very helpful. Um, so that this is one just a question that's came to me that I've heard in different places, and would be interested to hear your perspective on it. Do you think that Jesus himself may have had access to these Greek translations, the Septuagint, as it were, and may have even used it? But what would be your thoughts on that?
So what I don't think is that Jesus had a copy of the Septuagint, so to speak.
Right.
So I wouldn't say, and I don't say that Jesus used the Septuagint or that the Septuagint was Jesus's Bible. There's too much anachronism involved in those kinds of statements. Um, so I think a better question is, first of all, did Jesus know any Greek? And then second of all, how much access would Jesus have had to Greek copies of Scripture? Um, so I'll take those two questions at a time. One, did Jesus know any Greek? Answer, almost certainly. There was good reason to think that he's interacting with Roman officials in Greek to some extent during the crucifixion and the trial. But as someone who is involved in teaching throughout the Judean countryside, um, some of that's involved with Pharisees, scribes, more urban centered people who would have been Greek speakers, at least as a second language. Jesus is probably interacting again with Roman officials to some extent in Greek. Is he totally fluent? I don't know, but he's able to communicate to some extent. So that's and that's a whole different conversation and debate, and people go
Sure.
all over the place with that, right? Second question, would he have had access to Greek copies of Scripture? Probably about as much as any other person of his socioeconomic status, which was not particularly high. So the answer to that is no, he probably did not have a personal copy of any scripture that he's carrying around. He's going to be given access to scripture in the usual places like synagogues, prayer houses, and things of that nature. So, how much of that would have been copies of scripture in Greek translation? Probably a small subset, but I think that there would have been some of that in Jesus's ministry. How much? It's impossible to say, but I don't rule it out by any stretch.
Yeah, interesting. So we know. Actually, let me put this in a question. I was going to say we know that there's some quotations in the New Testament which seem to depend on a Septuagint rendering. But let me put that in a question. Do some quotations in the New Testament make a point that wouldn't really be as forceful, or maybe not really carry through at all, if they had been citing maybe a more literal rendering of the Hebrew text that we have today? I'm trying to word that the right way. I think you understand what I'm trying to get at, though.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, this is yet another complicated question that is complicated because it's related to a lot of unknowns or variables. But again, the answer is yes, the New Testament authors do cite scripture. And again, every scripture they cite is Greek scripture. Okay, so it's not like there's suddenly Hebrew script in the middle of the Greek New Testament.
Right.
So the question is, what does the form of the citation adhere to? Does it adhere to a form that's precedented in a Greek translation that's earlier, or does it conform to the sort of syntax that we have in a Hebrew manuscript? Okay, so even there's some debate, right? But it's very clear that at least a handful of cases, New Testament author has cited scripture in a form that lines right up with a Septuagint manuscript or critical edition that we have now, and differs from the Hebrew Bible in the form that we have it now. And so the question is, why would this New Testament author cite the Septuagint instead of the Hebrew, or against the Hebrew, or over the Hebrew? And you can see how
Yeah.
different presuppositions might get into how you just characterize it. But it does happen. A couple of examples. I mean, one of them would be Hebrews 10:5, which cites Psalm 40, verse 6. The Greek version there, the Hebrew Masoretic Hebrew version reads, my ears you have opened. The Septuagint, Greek translation of that is, a body you have prepared for me. So rather different. It's not even it's totally different, right? Um, and the author of Hebrews cites the Greek Septuagint version instead of the Masoretic version. So what do you do with that? Theologically, hermeneutically, what's the author doing? Why? That's a whole, separate cans of worms. But it does happen, and it's fascinating and complicated. But it does happen. I don't want to overstate how many times it happens, but it does happen.
That being said, I think these various cans of worms that you've mentioned here, you have been working on a project, I understand, that addresses some of these very cans, right? You're going into, I think you have a project that addresses the authority of the Septuagint. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for asking. It does segue rather neatly with the question. Um, Anybody who may be familiar with some of my work in the past may know that a lot of my projects in Septuagint I tackle along with my colleague at RTS Orlando, Dr. Gregory Lanier. He's a good friend of mine, and we have just finished a manuscript for a book that's coming out in the fall, and it's called The Authority of the Septuagint, Biblical, Historical, and Theological Approaches. It's coming out with IVP Academic. And the entire task of the book is to look at several kinds of citations in the New Testament, like what we just talked about, where a citation aligns with the Septuagint over the Hebrew, or the Hebrew over the Septuagint, or neither. Um, and to put those texts, and everybody's looking at the same set of texts, in front of a New Testament scholar, in front of a systematician, in front of a church historian, patristic scholar, and say, what do you think?
Yeah.
So that's the basic task of the book, and it gets right into this set of issues here.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. As I'm recording this book hasn't come out yet, I understand. But when it does come out, if you're watching this video in the future, make sure you check out the links in the description. I have a number of links for Dr. Ross down there, but we do have much more I'd like to get into in this video. One of the things that comes up quite often that I hear people put in the comment section is this idea that Origen created the Septuagint, basically out of nothing, right? Whole cloth. That Origen just created the Septuagint. There was no Septuagint before Origen. How could we? Of course, we know about. Well, maybe you can tell us a little bit about his project that he did. I mean, he's very much concerned with how the Greek scriptures that he had and the Hebrew copies that were available. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this, and then tell us if there's any merit to the idea that Origen created the Septuagint.
Yeah, good question. So I'll give you the spoiler alert first. The answer is no, but again, it's going to depend to some extent on what you mean when you say the Septuagint. So there's a little shred of yes in the no, but so that's where I'm heading from the outset. So Origen is sort of a major figure in the early church. He does all sorts of things. Some of them are pretty wacky. Well, a lot of them are wacky, including his textual criticism is wacky for anybody. So let's not pretend like that's the normal thing he did. But he did some weirder things than just that. But one of the most important legacies of Origen is his project that we call the Hexapla. We call it the Hexapla because it was basically a textual synopsis, a tool for textual comparison that had 6 columns, hence the name. He's doing this sometime in the early 200s, maybe somewhere between 200 and 240. And in those 6 columns, he's got a lot of different resources. Okay. In his first column, he has a Hebrew text. That Hebrew text does not have any vowels. So Hebrew in its ancient manuscripts had no vowels, only consonants. That's the text that Origen has in his first column. His second column has a Greek text that transcribes the Hebrew text so he knows how to pronounce it, at least according to his own conventions in his day in the Christian world, yada, yada. Then he's got 4 other columns, something called the version of Aquila, which is a recent translation of the Hebrew Bible. Another version called Symmachus by someone called Symmachus, same thing. And then something called Theodotion, yet another version of the Hebrew Bible. But in that 5th column, he's got something that he labels the Septuagint. And that is the focus of his work. And what Origen is trying to do is he's taking the Hebrew text that was circulating standard in his day, and the Septuagint text that was circulating standard in his day, and he's aligning them, column 1 and column 5, and using the other sources in the other columns to try to reconcile them. And as he does that, he's making annotations in the Greek text with different kinds of symbols. So, for example, if there's something in the Septuagint text that isn't present in the Hebrew text, he's going to give it one kind of symbol. Or the other way around, if there's something in the Hebrew text that wasn't in the Septuagint text, he's going to add it in from one of the other versions and mark it with a different symbol. Okay, so it's all this this huge project, must have taken a huge amount of time and money. That's the task that he's doing. Okay, so there's lots of color I could add around that. One of the things that happens, there's a lot of things that happens in the wake of his work, but that 5th column, which is the sort of result of all of his work, does not get copied in a particularly consistent way. And so all the little symbols that he's so carefully added drop out, get mixed up, moved. As you can imagine, extremely detailed work. And that text in the 5th column, we call it Origen's recension, the Origenic recension. And that 5th column is what tends to go and multiply as the text is copied, especially throughout Byzantium and the Byzantine Empire, and get reproduced and multiplied and spread. So that's the little sliver of yes in the question, right? Did Origen create the Septuagint? Well, he had a very massive effect on the textual history of the Septuagint corpus. Did he write it out of whole cloth from nothing? No, he did not. He had a source text, several source texts, and other versions that he was working from.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, it's my understanding, well, I shouldn't say it's my understanding. I'm under the impression that none of the we don't have any copies of the Hexapla left, do we? We don't have any direct. Are there that those all were destroyed over time, something like that? We don't have any of those left, do we?
It's not clear that more than one copy ever existed because it was so huge, multi-volume. What we do have are shreds, scraps, single leaves, parchments that preserve parts of the hexapla or copies of parts of the hexapla, or even smaller snippets. What we'll have is we'll have manuscripts of Greek, Old Testament scripture, and there'll be marginal readings, just a phrase, and there'll be a little annotation that says Symmachus or Theodotion, and we'll be able to use that as evidence for one of the columns in Origen's hexapla. We have a few, like maybe 24 or so actual manuscripts, and oftentimes they're Um, they're on palimpsests, which is basically a manuscript that's been erased and reused, and it's the old erased text behind the current text, whatever that may be, where we find some of these copies of the Hexapla. So it's very difficult going in terms of textual analysis, and you have to have a lot of tools at hand just to find the readings to try to cobble some of this together.
So, do Septuagint scholars believe that Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Sinaiticus, these all go back to Origen's work?
Yeah, in different ways, they do. There are very few Greek manuscripts of the Septuagint that have not been influenced in some way by Origen's work. Okay. Um, and this is part of the outcome of Origen's work, is he was trying to make things simpler and tidier, and he wound up making a huge tangled mess text critically for the rest of us because his fifth column was copied without the siglas that he was using, etc. So almost every copy of the Septuagint that we have, we just assume at this point that it's been influenced in whole or in part to various degrees by Origen's work. And so when we do textual criticism on the Septuagint, some of our most precious evidence is anything that was copied or produced prior to Origen. So the old Latin versions, for example, although they're in Latin, they're especially valuable because they were produced prior to Origen. So they give us important readings that aren't influenced by his hexaplaric contamination, if you will. So exactly how much influence Origen will have had in Vaticanus or Sinaiticus, it's hard to say, and to some extent that will differ on a book-to-book basis. So the influence in the Vaticanus text of Joshua is going to be a little bit different than the text of Deuteronomy in that same codex.
So, when you say it's influenced, so what I imagine people thinking, and what probably was in my head when I'm talking about this, is that, in his Hexapla, people are making direct copies. This becomes the authorized version, if you will, of the Septuagint from Origen's day. What it sounds like to me, maybe you're talking about, is that his text became sort of a gold standard from which you might want to correct your text. Is that more the idea?
Yeah, and yeah, part of what I mean is the additions or subtractions that Origen put into his fifth column, into his Septuagint text, will have made the copy into later manuscripts in different degrees. And as these texts are multiplied and copied, they're going to have their own variants. So yes, there's a sense in which that fifth column does become kind of a central textual stream, but there's also going to be variation as well. And the condition, if you will, of Origen's Septuagint text is going to be different for any given book as well. Again, Deuteronomy versus Joshua, things are going to be a little bit different in the textual state of the book at that time as well. So it's not just Origen and his influence, it's also what Origen took on board and worked with and passed along as well.
But there's before Origen's time, we have something that's recognizably being called. They might not call it the Septuagint, right? But they were referring to something as the interpretation of the 70, or something like that, is circulating at this time, because we hear people like Justin Martyr, arguing that I've got the superior text. He claims that the Hebrews have changed their text, that kind of thing. So that at least gives us some evidence that prior to Origen, there's something that what we now call the Church Fathers were recognizing as the translation of the 70, and it was had been in some way standardized by that time.
That's right. There is let's say by the second century, some conception of will say the Greek scriptures. Okay. That doesn't mean that every copy is exactly the same, but there's a sort of Textus Receptus of Greek scriptures, if you will, by the second century. Um, and that is part of the reason why you have other versions popping up, like Aquila or Symmachus, because there's some conception that there is a somewhat standard version of the Greek Bible, and some don't like how it is, and so they're going to produce their own version, which we call the recension, three Jewish recensions that I mentioned in the Hexapla. So yes, there is something of a standard, but that standard, this is Origen's motivation, that standard Septuagint, if you will, doesn't perfectly align with the standard Hebrew Bible in Origen's day as well. And his Hebrew text that he receives in his day is a proto-Masoretic text type. So you pick up a copy of the Hebrew Bible today, it's going to be a Masoretic text. By Origen's time, the Second Temple had been destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, and there's basically no other textual form that's in circulation. So the Proto-Masoretic text is kind of the only game in town, effectively, not functionally true, but effectively that is true. And so that's the text he's working with. The Targums are working with. A lot of secondary versions are working with as well. But it doesn't always perfectly line up with the Origen's Septuagint as well.
So just to these aren't scholarly questions at this point. I'm just trying to stamp on some conspiracies. Let's say Origen wildly changed the text. Let's just say, just for an example, by that time you have a fairly standardized something that's floating about that people have that they recognize as the interpretation of the 70. In other words, I guess what I'm asking, is it possible that Origen could have wildly changed the text and nobody noticed, or not an outcry from Origen's work?
Um, I think that's very doubtful. I mean, you've got a lot of the early church fathers, Justin, for example, in his dialogue with Trypho, is arguing there's this Jewish Christian interpretive argumentation taking place, and the full details of that are hard to develop, but they're arguing over interpretation of the text, and often the differences between a Hebrew and a Greek rendering of a particular passage, like Isaiah 7. And so there are a set of renderings, translations that are in circulation. Would they have been known to everybody? Not everybody, but certainly some of the, if you will, intellectual figureheads of early Christianity. Yeah, and same thing with the Jewish rabbis in the second and third centuries. They wouldn't have escaped their notice. So no, Origen's not going to be able to just come up with something completely different without people noticing. I mean, we can't underestimate. I know it's a long time ago, but we shouldn't and can't underestimate the level of rigor, textual, critical, linguistic rigor that somebody like Origen and other early church writers and early rabbis had. I mean, these guys were real scholars. So we shouldn't let our contemporary hubris diminish that or overlook it, right?
Yeah, they were very serious about it, and that's what's surprising. Without some of the modern tools that we have, but they were so steeped. Some of these men, especially Origen, it's hard to estimate what they would have. They were serious about it just as much as modern scholars are. Fortunately we have some tools that they didn't have, but yeah, that's very interesting. One of the questions I wanted to get to is and this is. So let me ask it this way. How do we know? So oftentimes we'll hear that New Testament quotations align with the Septuagint because our great manuscripts that we have post-date the the New Testament? How do we know that people didn't just adjust the Septuagint renderings to match the New Testament?
Yeah, yeah, this is a good question. If you will allow me, I want to just back up
Hmm.
a step before we get to that question. Uh, we addressed this a little earlier, but there, you do find people who say there's no Septuagint prior to the Christian era. Yes, it's the case that you don't find a full copy, so to speak, but we do have a few manuscripts that we found from Qumran and a few other papyri. There's at least three manuscripts dated to the second century, five dated to the first century BC. So yeah, they're small, they're scraps, they're not complete copies, etc., but they're certainly pre-Christian. And even if you want to doubt the paleography and say, oh, well, it might be first century AD, that's still Christian, plus all the scribal practices are Jewish and they're found in Jewish areas, etc. So there's really no question about copies of Greek scriptures circulating prior to the Christian era. Now we don't have a full copy, so we're often inevitably dealing with the full corpus of manuscript evidence for the Septuagint, which is mostly Christian copies like the major codices. So to go back to your main question, why is it, or could it be that the Septuagint itself, the Septuagint, was adjusted towards the New Testament itself? I mean, yes and no. In principle, that's possible, right? In principle, that's possible. We have no real reason, no honest reason to think that there was some kind of systemic conspiracy to do that, to modify and amend the text of the Septuagint to make it agree with the New Testament reading. But there are perhaps a few cases where you could argue that later copies of the Greek Septuagint have wording in a passage that was quoted in the New Testament that seems to have been moved towards the New Testament form. So it's
Yeah.
complicated to think about this, but that would mean that it was changed to the form that differed from the Septuagint when it was cited to make it look like the New Testament and Septuagint don't differ. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, that possibility, again, it's, in principle, it's possible. Possibility is part of the reason that textual critics tend to favor early manuscripts over later manuscripts because you tend to see this thing perhaps more often in late manuscripts, like 8th, 9th century. So again, to give you an example here, Psalm 22:16 says something like a lion are my hands and feet in the Hebrew. Okay. In the Greek version, it says, they pierced my hands and feet. Okay. That'll sound a lot more familiar to you. That's cited in John 20:25. Okay. So some people would look at this, and you can get conspiratorial here. If you want to say, okay, that Septuagint reading was adjusted to match the New Testament, here's what you would have to think. You would have to think the Septuagint, you'd have to think there was a the Septuagint first, and that it originally said something different than what it currently says, right? Maybe it said something similar to what Matthew or the Masoretic text says now. So, but it said something else. You then have to think that John kind of semi-cited Psalm 22 in the way that it reads in John 20:25, which was different from the Septuagint he was looking at or knew. Then you have to think that later Christian scribes adjusted the Septuagint that they had, which differed, to jive with John's miscitation of the psalm. Uh, Now, is all of that possible? I guess. But it's totally speculative and it's evidence free. Now, sometimes the motivation for wanting to think that, which I do not recommend, is that perhaps the Masoretic text has been altered. And it has been altered in a way to make readings like this less messianically susceptible for New Testament interpretation. And oftentimes that comes along with some less than charitable assumptions about our Jewish friends. So yeah, in principle, it's possible. In practice, I've yet to see any compelling reason to.
I think a lot of these, I think this is a similar theme as you're kind of debunking some of these conspiracies, is that they capitalize on the possible at the expense of the probable. And it seems like that's where a lot of these sort of things flourish. Coming back to that passage in John, and neither one of us probably have it in front of us here, but as my memory serves, and if you don't remember, that's fine. I think in the Greek Septuagint version, the verb that's used there is different than what John actually uses when he talks about piercing. So if he were, trying, I think that supports what you're trying to say. We can confirm that. But I think the verb in Psalm 22 might be oriso, if you're using modern pronunciation. They dug my hands and my feet. And I can't remember the one in John, but I think it's a different verb. Well, maybe we'll confirm that, but hard to do on the fly here.
Yeah. So in that case, John would be sort of the Septuagint would have been conceptually conformed to John's pseudo citation of something that didn't look like the Septuagint we have.
Right. Yeah, exactly. One thing I'd like to ask you, and I want to respect your time here. As someone who is a scholar, studied the Septuagint, you're also, people might not realize this, but you're also a Hebrew instructor. So you teach people Hebrew at RTS, I understand. And so deeply involved in both Hebrew and Greek. When the Septuagint and the Masoretic text diverge, and it looks like there's some sort of textual variant, that there was some sort of Proto-Hebrew text that maybe the Septuagint was following, which text do you generally tend to prefer? Well, if you'd like to see the rest of the interview with Dr. Ross, I have a link down in the pinned comment down below where you can join our membership. It's only $1.99 a month. It's not very expensive. I've done that on purpose so that people have an opportunity to support this channel if they'd like to. Go into a little bit more depth, and it's kind of interesting. I asked Dr. Ross a question after we were done with the interview that I was just interested in, and his answer was so interesting. I asked him if I could share it with the members of my channel. So you might want to see that. If you've made it this far into the interview, type in the comments "digging deep," and let's wrap up the rest of what we have here. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ross. You've been so generous with your time, and you've really given a lot of texture to a conversation that tends to get very flattened out. And I really appreciate you going into depth and sharing with us your time. And as I said, there'll be links in the description. I really appreciate Dr. Ross and I think Dr. Lanier helped you with these as well. The 2 volumes of the Septuagint, really helpful to students of Biblical Greek. His book, The Septuagint, what it is and why it matters. You can see I've got mine all earmarked. I've learned a great deal from this book. And he has a forthcoming book that when it's out, I'll be sure to put links in the description. I just want to thank you again, Dr. Ross.
Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.